So it's been some time since we last looked at the Dell XPS 720, and last time we were cleaning it and dusting it out, but today we're going to be benchmarking it. If you want to check out the benchmarks immediately, I'm going to put the time code right here. Otherwise, you're going to be explaining my testing methodology. I purchased the original GPU. The last one was the GT610 in there, and that was not the original GPU. But the one that was supposed to be in there is the 8800 GTX, which I made the switch to. The brand type was EVGA, and it's a blower style card. It has 128 CUDA cores, a base clock of 575 MHz, 768 megabytes of GDDR3 RAM, and it all runs in DirectX 10. And then for the RAM solution, I read a lot of forums saying that it was compatible with 8 GB of RAM, but this system was just not doing it. I don't know whether it was the board or just the compatibility. Yes, it has a 64-bit OS on there and everything like that, and the board is updated. So, I installed the latest revision of the BIOS, the A06 BIOS. So it supports 8 GB of RAM, but this board was not having it. So I went through a bunch of RAM sticks and all sorts of different combinations, and I eventually figured out that no other RAM would work in there unless I had the 2 original memory sticks in there working with the other ones. So I was only able to achieve a maximum of 4 GB of RAM. Anyways, I installed Windows 10 and the appropriate drivers for the 8800 GTX. Also, the heart of the beast has the Intel Q6600 quad core, locked and clocked at 2.4 GHz. Yes, this is a locked processor, and the board is also locked as well. Even if you threw an unlocked processor in there, it wouldn't matter. It's going to be a locked processor because of the motherboard. So everything is incredibly proprietary when it comes to Dell, including the fan pins. So it's ridiculous. So I'll be testing DirectX 10 compatible titles at 720p and 1080p. But primarily what we're going to be judging by and comparing with for the gaming experience is going to be 720p, because that was a lot more prevalent at the time than 1080p. And also, I didn't run any sort of capture software while running these games because everything else was already tasked enough, and I didn't want it to hinder or interfere with my gaming performance at all. So I didn't run any capture software while playing any of these games, but yeah, let's get into the benchmarks and talk about it. Alright, first game we're testing is Tomb Raider 2013 release, which is 5 years after the XPS was available, but was DX10 compatible, so this would be definitely a decent challenge for the GPU. At 720p in high settings, we see an average of 73 FPS with minor stutters or lags, with the 1% low dipping around to 61 FPS and the lowest at 54 FPS for the lowest of frames. Not bad at all, and certainly playable at 720p. Also, by the way, I hope you like the layout of the benchmark graphs. I tried to make it as easy to understand as possible with a simplistic and friendly layout. So anyways, let's move on to the 1080p benchmark. At 1080p normal settings, we see an average of 38 FPS with minimal stutters once again, with a 1% low around 34 FPS and a 0.1% low of 31. These frames are pretty tight knit, and even at an average of 38 FPS, still made a very playable experience. Another very challenging game was Metro Last Light Redux. Released 7 years later from the XPS 720, which was 2014, it definitely poses a threat and challenge to the GPU. At 720p and medium settings, I only managed to get about 32 FPS on average, but the average FPS does not tell the whole story here. Okay, so there was a lot of stuttering, and the FPS was very inconsistent. It usually would sit around in the low 30s and upper 20s, and then spike up to 50 and then drop to 17, making it very hard to determine an accurate graph to represent the gaming experience. As you can see here, there's a 1% low of 22 and a 0.1% low of 17. Which may not sound too far apart to make a chopping gaming experience, but the random spikes and drops in the FPS definitely made that a reality. At 1080p, things got a lot worse, with an average of 24 and a 1% low of 12 and a 0.1% low of 2 FPS. As you can see here, this is a major disparity between the average 1% low and 0.1% low. With that large of a difference, this clearly indicates massive stuttering, in which there was. This game was virtually unplayable at this point, but I mean, what else could you expect for a game coming out 7 years later than the components in this PC? Okay, so here's another late release for the XPS 720, but a bit easier to run than Metro, Saints Row 4. At 720p and medium settings, this game ran pretty smoothly. Here we've got an average of 40 FPS, 1% low of 37, and a 0.1% low of 27 FPS. The average and the 1% low are pretty close to each other, showing that there wasn't a whole lot of frame dropping and stuttering. but the 0.1% low shows on the off occasion that there was. For the most part, this game played pretty smoothly, but whenever I was in a vehicle, the frames dropped significantly, but outside a vehicle, the frames were smoother and not as much of a difference in frame times. So even while I was running around and shooting aliens, the frames were pretty smooth. So overall, playable experience despite the one condition with the vehicle. Now at 1080p, I left the settings at medium, but this time a lot more stutters and drops than the 720p experience. Here we've got an average of 26, a 1% low of 17, and a 0.1% low of 10 FPS. This was not so much of a playable experience, and really not much else to say than that really. So here's a much fairer comparison for the XPS 720, and here we've got the original BIOSHOCK, which came out in 2007, and this game played very well, shockingly enough. I'll see myself out now. Anyways, this game played very well at 720p in high settings. I got an average of 107, 1% low of 88, and a 0.1% low of 54 FPS. Now on average, the 8800 GTX had no problem with this game, churning out high frames and consistent frame times, occasionally dipping to 88 and on the rare occasion to the high 50s. So there was an occasional stutter or two, but luckily the 1% low and the average are relatively close to each other in comparison, demonstrating consistent flowing frames. At 1080p high settings, we see an average of 54, a 1% low of 47, and a 0.1% low of 45 FPS. These numbers are all very close to each other, indicating that even at 1080p, this game was running pretty smoothly. So even at 1080p, I would consider this a respectable and enjoyable gaming experience. Can you guess which game is next? Ever heard of the phrase, but can it run CRYSIS? Yes, I tested the original CRYSIS on this machine. This released in 2007 and was notably one of the most difficult games to run. Anyways, at 720p medium settings, I got an average of 38, 1% low of 27, and a 0.1% low of 22 FPS. There were some occasional frame drops into the low 20s, hence the 0.1% low of 22 frames, but other than that, this game was decently playable around the mid to upper 30s. The only time where the frames started to drop was in large open areas with multiple vehicles and enemies running around, but that was about it. Here at 1080p, there wasn't too much of a loss in the average FPS, with it coming in at 31 and a 1% low of 26 and a 0.1% low of 17. But the stutters were much more apparent at 1080p than 720p, dropping down into the mid to upper teens. Still not as abysmal and unplayable as Metro, but not a very fun gaming experience. Okay, so the next benchmark is the Heaven benchmark by Unigen. I had to run this test at DirectX 9 since there was no DirectX 10 option supported. At 720p medium settings, the 8800 GTX got an average of 29, 1% low of 19, and a 0.1% low of 13 FPS. So not too great. Lots of stuttering and frame time inconsistency, and the GPU was running at about 76 degrees Celsius, which isn't too hot for running Heaven benchmarks. But I mean, hey, it is only a blower style card. And nonetheless, I continued to proceed with testing this card at 1080p, which was really pushing this, low settings. And yeah, you can see this was pretty painful. Here I got an average of 14 FPS, 1% low of 9, and a 0.1% of 4. Nothing else to really say from here on. So moving on to the CPU benchmarks, I ran CINEBENCH with the Q6600 clocked at 2.4 GHz, which keep in mind is a locked processor. And anyways, in the multi-threaded performance, it scored 196, whereas the 7700K scored 985 for comparison. Wow. This actually makes Intel look like it hasn't stagnated over the last couple of years. Anyways, I didn't run a single threaded benchmark since that would just take way too long with the Q6600. Anyways, moving on to CPU Z, the Q6600 scored a multi-threaded performance of 655 and a single-threaded performance of 167, whereas the 7700K scored 2,648 for multi-threaded and 492 for single-thread. And in GEEKBENCH, the Q6600 scored 2,342 for multi-thread and 1,278 for single-thread, and the 7700K here just blew it out of the water, obviously. So, pretty stark comparisons here, but it's neat to see how far processors have come from about 10 years ago, despite Intel's lack of improvement over the last couple of years. But, you know, still a cool comparison. So yeah, that's how this baby held up. I mean, not too shabby of a performance, especially for its time. 720p with some of the earlier titles was definitely a lot easier to play, like BIOSHOCK. CRYSIS, of course, is it's CRYSIS. So it's a CRYSIS to your PC, but for $2,000, hopefully this wasn't too steep of a price at the time. But the Q6600 was one of the early quad cores on the market, so you know, the price was steep for this at the time. But you know what's gonna happen next time with this PC? See if you can answer it in the comments below. Just take a random guess and I'll pin your comments. So yeah, I hope you guys all enjoyed the benchmarks, and if you want to see more videos where I deal with old PCs and stuff, I'm going to put a playlist up here. And also there's a Patreon link down below if you want to help donate to the channel. Anything is incredibly and sincerely appreciated. And yeah, I can't thank you enough if you do donate, and even if you're watching this video, thank you already. But yeah, that's everything this PC has to offer. I want to thank you guys all for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.